This is Play-by-Playcast.
Is that faster than a Greyhound?
The podcast about play-by-play guys. For play-by-play guys, by, I'm told, a play-by-play guy.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him.
Now here's the host of Play-by-Playcast, Tom Bodett. Wait, the Motel 6 guy?
We'll leave the light on for you.
No, Joel Godet.
Joe Godet.
Joel.
Joel?
Joel, with an L.
Okay, here's your host, Joel Godet.
Don't worry, nobody's listening anyway.
All right, another week, another pod. Thanks as always for the subscribe, the stream, the download, checking out Play-by-Playcast, the podcast about play-by-play broadcasters for play-by-play broadcasters, hosted by a play-by-play broadcaster. My name is Joel Godet. I'm the radio and television voice of the Ball State University Cardinals, and this is a professional development podcast that dives into the tips, tricks, experience, process, stories, and preparation of some of the biggest and best play-by-play announcers in the business. Our guest this week is Bill Roth, who I have known for 11 years. I have known Bill Roth for about more than a third of my life. I have known Bill Roth, the longtime voice of the Virginia Tech Hokies from 1988 until 2015. He then moved to UCLA as their football and basketball radio voice, and then came back east and has a host of projects now. Among them, he does college basketball for a couple different outlets and college football on ESPN. He's made the switch over to the television side. He is teaching, which we will get to in a second, and then he does some radio hits, the Roth Report, ACC Today, whole bunch of different ventures that Bill is tied up in. He's not lacking for something to do. And chief amongst that, really, Bill, since I've known him, has been a teacher, has been a guy that has always been willing to take someone under their wing. And he and I have spent countless hours on the phone talking about career, the business, the craft, life, a lot more time that he has spent on the phone with me than he would ever like to or need to. But he's always been willing to lend a hand and lend an ear, really going back to when I first met him. I mean, he was just outgoing and helpful from Jump Street while we sat together at a restaurant in Salem, Virginia, eating a pizza called the Raj. I don't know what was on the Raj anymore. I have since forgotten. I think it was like a pepperoni sausage. There might have been some mushrooms on there. I don't remember what else was on the Raj, but the pizza was called the Raj, and that was the first time Bill and I met. Jason Benetti was there as well, and am I leaving somebody else out? I think there was a fourth. Oh, Alex Vispoli, I believe, was our fourth. Former minor league baseball broadcaster and now working up, doing a lot of play-by-play and media in Boston. It was the four of us the very first time I met Bill Roth over a pizza called the Raj. But so teaching has always been kind of central to who he is. And he now spearheads the sports media and analytics concentration at Virginia Tech. And I'll read from their website. I mean, it's a degree that prepares you for a career in sports communication and broadcast performance. And I mean, basically cuts to the chase. There are a lot of places you can go. We talk about Syracuse all the time on this podcast. I love Syracuse. It's near and dear to my heart. It's very expensive. We will talk about it on this episode of the podcast. There are places you can go now. It's becoming more of a common course of study. I mean, Ball State University is hung its hat where I work on a digital sports production track now at this point. The options that you have to go into this field and this craft are so numerous, and Bill has really embraced that at Virginia Tech. So if you're in high school and you listen to this podcast and you are curious about options that you have out there, take a look at VodTech and take a look at Bill and what he has going on there and the options that are provided to you in Blacksburg, among all of the other places that you'll look as well. But we cover a lot of ground with all of that being said on this edition of the pod. We'll talk about his time at Virginia Tech. We'll talk about his time at UCLA. We will literally do the breakdown of radio versus television and the craft side of this podcast, one of the hallmarks of what we do. But of course, where else would we start? Bill Roth is a Syracuse guy. There's actually, when I was in college, there was an edit suite at WAER Radio with his picture outside of it. It's called the Roth. Hey, where are you editing? I'm in the Roth. That's the Roth. It was just the sports edit suite that we always used. So I guess that was the first time I ever had interaction with him, was when I walked into college. But the first time I met him, I said, was in 2007. So Bill is synonymous with WAER and Syracuse. And actually, the very first words that you ever hear, I don't know if that is the case anymore, but certainly when I was in college, the very first words you ever heard for a Syracuse WAER broadcast were Bill's words. It was his voice. There was always this little bump that would play, and it would say, "You're listening to WAER, the original home of the Orange." And it was Bill Roth's voice, the start of every single football, basketball, or lacrosse broadcast. So as we do with many, as we do with all Syracuse guys we have on this podcast, we start with his time at WAER with the likes of Mike Tirico and Ian Eagle and Dan Horde and everybody that was there in the late 80s, including Paul Peck, who we had on this podcast several weeks ago. And we actually talked about a game that he and Bill did together, the 1987 National Championship game, Syracuse against Indiana. And as we recorded this podcast, Bill had actually just found the cassette tape of that game. That's where we begin. Pleasure to finally have Bill Roth on this podcast, a guy that's meant a lot to me over the last decade. Bill Roth on PXPcast.
It's funny. I have no idea what to do with this cassette because I don't even have a player anymore. So it's kind of worthless. It's just a plastic case. That was an amazing time because Bobby Knight in Indiana were rolling, and Coach Patino was at Providence, and Jerry Tarkanian was at UNLV, and then Jim Boeheim at Syracuse. And that was the Final Four. So the press conferences were unbelievable. The games were incredible. Syracuse and Providence had a bench-clearing brawl in the national semifinal game. And at the time, it was the largest crowd to ever see a college basketball game. And then that was eclipsed a couple nights later for the championship game. So as a college kid, you're around all these superstars, these amazing crowds and coaches, and there's a national championship on the line for your alma mater in your senior year. So it was really overwhelming, but it was an amazing opportunity, and one of those great opportunities that you hear a lot from those of us that went to Syracuse.
Did you call the bench clearing brawl, or was that Paul?
You know, it's a great question, and I don't recall. I know
it made a very large impact.
Well, back in the 80s, in the Big East, there was a brawl every game. I mean,
fair.
Syracuse-Georgetown was like WrestleMania every game. And whether it was at that time, the Cap Center or the Dome or down at Madison Square Garden, it seemed like there was always a fight and people getting a headlock in the middle of the basketball court.
What do you remember about calling a national title game as a high school or as a college senior, and being on that stage? And I mean, being in an arena with the largest crowd to ever witness a college basketball game to that point. And we talk a lot on this podcast about how you handle elevated, heightened situations. That's like the premio as a student being on that stage. How do you handle it?
It was a combination of spring break and a career launch. At least that's what you'd want it to be, all at the same time. Because, you're in New Orleans, and Joe, I know you never go out, but there are things other to do on Bourbon Street. Yeah, there's other things to do in New Orleans when you're on spring break with all your college friends than prepare a play-by-play chart and figure out if Sherman Douglas is going to guard Steve Alford. And so I think we had a good time. I mean, Paul and I did the game. Tirico was our sideline reporter. I thought we had a pretty good broadcast, and it ended up being a classic championship game. And for Indiana, one of their great moments ever. And for those of us that were graduating from Syracuse a month later, it was a real devastator.
Sideline reporter never went on to do anything, though. Just flamed out.
No, we had Mike rolling around the Superdome. Mike was a year behind, so the seniors got to do the game, and Mike was the junior. So he was roaming around the Dome in New Orleans, interviewing VIPs. And there were a lot of them there that night.
What was it like as a student back then? Because, and I guess it's different now because it's 30 years after the fact, so we can kind of look back on it and you see what everybody has gone on to become. But I always say that was like the golden age of AER because of the amount of people that were there in like a 6-year window. What was it like, and did you kind of know that everyone there was going to go on to do what they did at the time? Did you kind of have a feeling that this was a good group?
I think everybody knew how great Tirico was, but there were some other great people there that Doug Sherman, who's with ESPN, and John Frankel, who's gone on to great things at HBO. Dave O'Brien was on our staff, and he's with the Red Sox, and Todd Callis with the Astros. And yeah, I mean, there was no lack of talent, but you know what? You didn't think about it then. We were just a bunch of college kids and trying to do what college kids do, cut class and not get caught. Who's going to get the better game? Who's driving to Morgantown? I mean, those are the things that you really focused on, not necessarily who's going to do what. It was a different era in terms of when you could get out of college, the jobs that people got. My first year there, Greg Papa graduated, and his first job was the voice of the Indiana Pacers. And, Sean McDonough, who was in Greg's class too, same thing. He jumped right to Boston. And, that we're not seeing that today like we saw in the mid-'80s or the late 80s, I guess I should say, where you could pop right out of Syracuse and get on the air. But that being said, a lot of guys did that. Danny Roach went back to Boston, and he's been a star at WBZ ever since. And so it was just a totally different era.
What was Tirico like?
He had a lot of hair.
I've heard we've had anecdotes on this podcast before that like professors used to genuflect as he walked by.
Mike, he was one of those guys that when you walked in, you just knew how amazingly talented he was. But probably like everyone else who's been on your show, what an amazing person he was. I mean, he was just a great guy to be around. And we had so many great memories, but most of them are hanging around downtown, having a pizza or 2 a.m. in the studio, cutting a pregame show. And so to those of us, he was just Mike. He wasn't what everybody knows today. I will tell you that in 1986, we all went to Philadelphia to broadcast a Syracuse Temple football game, and we stayed at Harry Callis's house because Todd was on the staff. So if you can imagine, it was me and Paul Peck and Mike Tirico and Todd, and we all drove down. They had a house. Their home was right outside of Philadelphia. And I remember this vividly because it was the weekend that the Red Sox and the Mets played in the '86 World Series. In fact, we watched the ball go through Bill Buckner's legs in Harry Callis's basement. But it was just surreal because you're sitting around the table. They made breakfast for us. And, you're used to Harry Callis talking about the Phillies and Juan Samuel, and instead you're getting, would you please pass the ketchup? And it was just so awesome back then. So I think we were just in awe of being there, but it was just a bunch of college kids.
That's wild, actually. Did he say it's out of here when the ball went through Buckner's legs? Like just gets up, walks out, leaves the room.
It was amazing. I vividly recalled in their home in Radnor. Harry was great, by the way, to all of us. And I think that's an advantage that, we see now where Ian Eagle's son Noah's at SU, and, Todd's dad was so successful.
I'm sorry, that's his son?
A lot of that.
I just figured he went back to school. It was the same guy.
Yeah. So, the legacies that go through Syracuse are pretty strong.
Yeah.
And it was really nice to have a resource like Harry Callis.
Who'd you look up to when you were in college or even before? Who were the guys that got you into this and why?
Well, growing up in Pittsburgh, the announcers were held in such high esteem, and Mike Lang, who is the broadcaster for the Penguins, still lived in my neighborhood. And I had a chance to meet him and talk with him, and he kind of painted the picture for me even when I was in high school. But that was the era where the baseball announcers were gods to me, whether it was Joe Buck or Vin Scully, and the guys who did the Pirates games, Bob Prince, and then Milo Hamilton, who ended up in Houston for all those years. Those are the people. But I would say Buck and Vin Scully, and then of course Bob Costas.
Why do you do what you do? What is it about all of this that attracted you, that drew you in, that was the lure of it all?
Well, Joel, if you've seen me, I know this comes as a great shock. I was not a great high school athlete.
No. Stop it.
I know. Shocking. I could have been a great basketball player. I'm convinced the one thing that held me back, Joel, the one thing was gravity. Because It really hurt my 360 move. Just loved it. I mean, I remember sitting in Three River Stadium, and everybody else would be looking at the Pirates would be getting set to play the Phillies or the Dodgers, and all my buddies, and they'd be looking at Dave Lopes and Ron Say and Steve Garvey and Tommy Lasorda and Dusty Baker and all those great Dodgers, and I'd be turning around looking up in the booth trying to find Vin, and I was just weird, I guess, in that way. That to me, the stars were in the booth, not in the dugout.
You know, you said that it was a different era back then, too, in terms of when guys got into it and they came out of college and they were winding up in big-time jobs and in big-time markets. It's funny with the way things wound up for you is you wound up at Virginia Tech pretty quickly. It was not Virginia Tech back then, though. Did you think when you got there that 28 years later you would still be the voice of the Virginia Tech Hokies and that it would turn into what it turned into?
Well, when I first came to Virginia Tech back in 1988, it reminded me so much of Penn State, a school. I grew up in Pittsburgh, and so I had a lot of opportunities to go to Beaver Stadium, and half my high school, I think, went to Penn State. So when I first came down here, it was like, this looks just like State College. And there are a lot of similarities in terms of the fan base. It's a somewhat rural campus that you drive up, and then there's this massive football stadium, and the football aspect of it can almost be like a religion. But the passion for the school is there, and Virginia Tech always had that. And I just kind of rode it. Frank Beamer was a very young coach, and he turned it into something really good. And then the program got into the Big East, which really launched it nationally, and then the ACC. And it was a time in Virginia where the population really grew, and some great players played high school football in this state, like Michael Vick and D'Angelo Hall, and names that people are really familiar with. And they came here and they won an awful lot of football games over that quarter century.
How did you come up with the opening line that you had before every broadcast, and when did that become a thing for you?
Well, from the blue waters of the Chesapeake Bay to the hills of Tennessee, that line.
Virginia Tech Hokies are on the air.
On the air, yeah. So the original format for the game called for Hokies are on the air as a cue to hit a pre-produced kind of stinger that went into billboards. And that was the cue for the engineer. And so that's how I had to end it. He was waiting to hear the words on the air, and then boom, it fired, and there was that sound effect stinger. But I wanted to lead something into it, and I talked with a bunch of different people about it, and another SU colleague of ours, Tony Caridi, worked up in West Virginia, and Jack Fleming, the longtime voice of the Steelers and WVU, would always write this long scene setter, and Jack had something very similar to that, and so I wrote something up that I thought would kind of reflect the mission of the radio network at the time, which was to reach fans regardless of where they were throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia. And so that's what I came up with, and people seemed to like it. And so I kept doing it, and then it really caught on.
You know, I read and we've had this conversation before as well, but and you've said publicly since that you didn't regret the decision to go to UCLA the year that you spent out west. What did you learn about doing that? And how much of an introspective experience was it for you to be out in the Conference of Champions?
Well, personally, I learned an awful lot about myself and what's important to me, which would be a totally different podcast.
But I mean, I'm glad you started there though, because I asked the question just from the standpoint of like, particularly on the younger side in this industry, and I'll stick my hand in the air on that one. Like, you always kind of think about like the what's next, what else is out there kind of feeling, and sometimes when you're on the younger side, you forget like, well, you've got it. Where you are right now is really good, and so I was curious from your standpoint of seeing that from your perspective and how much you missed being where you were once it was gone.
Yeah, but UCLA is an amazing school. Great people, really great place. It just wasn't a good fit for me. It paid an awful lot of money. I will say that. And people say, well, the grass wasn't greener. Well, it was way greener. But
it was bluer, actually.
Yeah.
Waved.
Yeah, I just thought that I had to try it. It's an iconic program, and I wanted to give that a run, and I learned an awful lot. The broadcasting aspect is essentially the same. It doesn't really matter if you're in a New York or LA kind of market, or if you're in a way smaller market. When you're on the air, it doesn't matter if there's 3 people listening or 3 million. It's the craft that's important, not how many people are listening. And so it wasn't professional. I just didn't fit in LA as I had hoped, and as they had hoped, obviously, as well. So I had the opportunity to come back to Tech and get into TV 3 years ago, and it's been a lot of fun over the last couple of years. But no, I don't regret giving it a shot. I think had I not tried, I think that's where the regret would have been.
Sure, 100%. No, it makes perfect sense that way too. Let's talk about the craft side of it though, and how that remains the same, or I guess in some ways different, because now you're doing a lot of television work, and you and I have had the conversation before about the fact that they are 2 completely different animals. So, and I know you spoke about that this summer in Winston. So, blank canvas for you in terms of differences between television and radio, and how you've conquered those.
Well, you know it, and you're doing it really well. I mean, you're doing Ball State, and then you're popping on Big Ten Network, or you're popping on CBS. You know the difference, right?
I don't know if I do
totally
it well,
different.
but I do know the difference.
I think when you're doing radio, whether you're doing a high school game or a college game or even a pro game, in a lot of ways, you're kind of like the acoustic guitar solo act. You're kind of up there by yourself. You are the producer, the director. You're telling the story. As Vin would say, paint the picture. There's a real craft to that, and I think that's the best way to put it. In television, the play-by-play guy is totally a facilitator. It's almost as if instead of the solo act with the acoustic guitar, you're part of a big symphony, and you're setting up your analyst, and you're working with your producer and your director, and you're using the pictures to tell the story. You're writing the captions to the picture, and it's totally different. But a lot of the skills are the same, but you're definitely part of a bigger team. And for me, I really enjoy working with a graphics guy all week about what we're going to build and talking about storylines and how we're going to tell them with my producer and my analyst. And I was blessed. At Virginia Tech, I had one color guy the whole time for 27 years and hundreds of games and thousands of hours, and that's Mike Burnop. And I really enjoy if I'm working with Mike Golick or Christian Ponder or Ray Bentley, and this year John Kangemi. I enjoy working with them and setting them up, just like I did with Mike. I think there's a lot of chemistry that's the most important thing to any of these broadcasts.
Tell me about the prep part of that, like the week leading into it, and what kind of work do you do in terms of like dealing with producers, dealing with graphics people, how you're going to paint stories? Like, what is the conversation you guys have in terms of setting up the story arc in advance?
Well, I'm learning on that regard too, and that's been the biggest difference. I think when we would prep for a radio broadcast, you do your chart and you put in stats and you put in field goal percentage and 3-point percentage and free throw percentage and trends and whatnot. And there was a big focus on numbers. And on TV, particularly with ESPN, every week in the meetings, they talk about the fact that you want to humanize everything. And that's the most important thing. You don't look at the game notes to necessarily get Virginia hasn't beaten a top 20 team in 4 years. You look at the story of Bronco Mendenhall and how is this win over Miami going to impact his program and what they're trying to do. And you tell his story. And I think that's more what it is. And so in the preparation for it, it's a lot different. I find myself doing less filling in stats and more writing down on a card someone's personal story or his or her background.
It's almost as if I feel like I could do a broadcast on the radio without ever talking to a person. It wouldn't be good, but you could do a radio broadcast without ever doing an interview. Like if I didn't speak to a player, it would be fine. If I tried to do that on television, it would be a disaster. Does that make sense?
Exactly. And that's what I've worked with some really great producers too, by the way. I've been talking about some of these analysts, but the producers were really storytellers. It's really a television show more than it is a game. And it's becoming more and more that way. And I think so, for example, I think that's what ESPN felt with Joe Tess, is that it'll be more of a show. And I think that the industry is going that way. It's really not a game. It is to us because we're play-by-play guys and we're sportscasters. But for the network, it's a television show. And whether it's ESPN's Monday Night Football or ESPN's Saturday Night Primetime, that's the name of the show. and our job is to embellish and tell the story and make it a great show. If it's a good game, that's terrific, that it's easier. But if it's not a good game, it's up to us to make it a really entertaining show.
So what do you need going into it? Like, what's the mandatory for you in terms of, is it you've got to read X, Y, and Z, or this is a conversation you have to have, and then in that conversation, what are the most important questions that you need answered going into any given week?
If you get a great SID, he can really help you along, because there'll be some clippings and you'll go back and read a feature story on a young man or his mom and dad or his brother, and then you can work on that. I would say it's easier at the beginning of the season in a way, because we're in the week 8, 9 now, the college football season, and a lot of the good stories have been taken. And if you're doing a Clemson game, how many times can you tell the Kelly Bryant story now? And so I think that in the grand scheme of things, it's doing homework, and it's not looking at statistics and free throw percentage in basketball or yards per carry in football. It's tell me about a guy, tell me about a coach. Why is this happening in the game? Is it in a big picture kind of way? But secondly, it's really setting up the analyst. A lot of it is, Ray, how do you want to tell this story? Or Mike Golick Jr. is tremendous. And I'll say, all right, Mike, I'm going to set you up on this. How should we say it? How do you want to pitch this? And you do that in meetings, and then your producer will chime in. All right, let's build a graphic for that. Or let's get some video from his high school game, so when you tell that story. And so it's really just a collaborative effort where there's a bunch of people sitting around a table or on a conference call going through it.
Is it harder to paint the picture or to caption a picture?
I think they're both challenging in their own way, but like anything else, if you prepare for it and know what you're going in and have a game plan, the hardest chemistry test can be easy, even if you stink at chemistry, which I did. But if you kind of know what you want to do, they're both achievable.
Well, I asked that as kind of a loaded question too, just from the standpoint of, because while you're captioning a picture on television, you still have to actually call the game too. And that, I think, is always the difficult balance. How did you find that balance, and how do you strike that balance of physically calling the game but not saying too much, because they can obviously see the picture, and then at the same time being the captioner and the storyteller in chief as well?
You are a really good interviewer. Great question. All right, so here's an example of that, because I didn't know 3 years ago when I started doing TV all the time, because I'd done a lot of radio. So I had breakfast with a director who's done a bunch of my games. His name is Tim Sutton. Tim, longtime guy in Chicago, and was a EP at the Big Ten Network, and really helped launch that when it started a decade ago. And he said to me, as a director, when I walk into a stadium, I look where my cameras are going to be, and what am I going to do after there's a touchdown? He said, so if I'm doing a game at Wisconsin, between Wisconsin and, say, Michigan, and Wisconsin scores a touchdown, I have in my head exactly how I'm going to punch it up. I'm going to show the touchdown. I'm going to take a shot of the crowd. I'm going to go back to the celebrating players. Then I'm going to show the Wisconsin coach back to the crowd. I'm going to put a mic on the band. We're going to hear them play the Wisconsin fight song. I'll show the Michigan coach back to the crowd, right? All that happens in like 7 seconds, right? And I have in my mind as a director what I'm going to punch up. If you, as the play-by-play guy, talk over me while I'm doing that and talk about it's his 4th touchdown in 4 weeks, something like that, you've ruined what I want to do to tell the story, which is Wisconsin's got a great fight song. We need to hear that. And that's the collaborative effort of it. That's where I say it's like a symphony. So a good play-by-play guy is going to get out because it's the picture that's telling the story. It's the audio of the Wisconsin band, and it's Tim in the truck punching up the different cameras in an 8 to 10 second sequence that really is riveting to the audience. And so a play-by-play guy could mess that up if he talks or says something that doesn't fit the picture.
So when do you jump in with the 4 touchdowns in 4 weeks deal? Like, you know what I mean?
Like what I usually do is lay out as soon as we wipe to the replay, let the analyst come in. Yeah, in that instance, I think less is more. Now it helps if there's a packed stadium. If you're doing a game and
true,
and you don't have that roar and the band isn't mic'd and nothing happens, then you got to change your strategy. But I think there you kind of step aside and let a good analyst recap the play right out of the replay.
Well, and then like the X number of touchdowns and X number of weeks becomes a pre-snap comment later. You know what I mean?
Yeah, or you let your graphic guy put it up, and that's another
that's
thing
true too.
that we really work a lot on is my talent stats people. Don't hand me a piece of paper with a stat on it. Tell the truck first, and then we'll do it together. I think it's really important that it's a visual medium, and you just don't read a stat on the air on television. You get support from the truck, and I think one of the other things is that you go back to your main. There's such quick audience turnover, and Joe, you and I we talked about this a lot. The top of the game notes, what you use in radio, go back to it all the time because the people that were listening at 3 o'clock aren't listening at 20 after, and it's the same thing in television. You want to reset a bunch and reintroduce what you're doing and whatever those top storylines are, keep going back to it. It may sound repetitive, but in the grand scheme of things, the simpler you keep it, probably the better you are.
How do you work in an analyst too? Best practices from that standpoint. Like, are you a leading question type or a direct question or just like a leading statement and then turn to him and look at him and have the expectation he's going to pick up on it? Like, how do you best weave in the person standing next to you?
Well, but I've been really lucky. They've given me some really great analysts. So like with Golick, it's not hard. I mean, he's just going to jump right in and go, whoa, here we go at Navy. Look at that play, right? And here's what happened, and he's like, give me the stylus so I can design, on the telestrator. Here's what happened, right? Mike's just is that way. So I've been really lucky to have guys that are talkative and really know the game.
Is there a challenge in that, though, too? Because you've got to be able to, I guess, both A, direct that, or B, just go in the direction that they want to take you also and be able to make it work as a cohesive unit.
Yeah, I'm just having fun with it, and I think that's something that you can build regardless of where you are. Have lunch with your analyst all the time, and hang around him, and go to dinner, and go to events, and get their cadence and pacing down, and they get to learn your cadence and pacing as well. And usually, a lot of the things that we talk about on the air, we've talked about before we ever went on the air. So it's kind of the second time going through it. But if you have a really talkative guy, Mike's really, really talented. He's on the air every day doing his talk show, and he's on TV as well, a radio talk show and on TV. So he's incredibly cerebral. His background as a college player at Notre Dame really allows him to tell some fascinating stories, and he's going to be a huge star. He already is, but I think he'll be even a bigger star as we go forward over the next couple of years.
If I can get into the nitty-gritty, and this maybe is more of a radio question than a TV question as well, but the physical, it's definitely more of a radio question, the physical play calling aspect of things too. When you sit down and listen back to something, what is most important and what has to be in there every time? Because the thought I had, and I was thinking back, like I'm listening back to this past week's game that I did, and it was like, if there are 7 things you need in every play, I felt like on every play I had 5 of them, and it was a different 5. And like, that's fine. Like, like a rainbow with 5 colors is great, but a rainbow with 7 colors is complete. What are the 7 things that you need to have in there? And is it okay to, from time to time, drop 1 or 2?
Yeah, particularly when teams are going fast with this high octane no huddle pace that just about everybody does these days. But you're really spot on. The last couple of years, I've gone and done the Liberty Bowl on ESPN radio, and it's like, all right, you got to give the down and distance before every play now. Whereas on television, you may never give it because it's on the screen. People can see it. And you've got to be really conscientious about the time and the score. And I think we all have our own styles, right? I always love to give the hash mark or the wide and short side. And I'm big on the score, but I'm big on defensive formations too. And so if the safety's creeping up on a blitz, I'm probably likely to say that pre-snap than some other people were, because people are always thinking about what the offense is doing. And I'm more likely to say, it's 3rd and 8, for example, and you've been talking about a team has converted maybe 4 straight third downs, and you say, all right, they're coming on the blitz, the safety's creeping up, or they're backing off into zone. And so I think there's probably more than 7, but you got to rotate them through during the course of the game. If you're always setting the same formation over and over and over, it'll become a little bit repetitive to the fan. And then you get into this, you've heard this, I'm sure too, Joel, and a lot of young people's play-by-play. You get this constant stream of play-by-play where it sounds like the same thing over and over again for 20 minutes. And a good high school or a good college football game can become drone zone, and it puts you to sleep because you're in that same tempo, play after play after play.
How do you look for that on the defensive side in particular? I feel like the thing that we have hesitancy toward as broadcasters is, like, we always give the offensive formation because there's a fear that if you take your eyes off the offense, you'll be lost. So it's like the second you look to defense, like you miss the guy coming in motion, then there's a snap and a handoff and a jet sweep, and you're like, where did that come from? Is it just it's a comfortability, and you've got to be in control, and you've got to understand the pace of it to be able to see the whole field?
A little bit. That probably comes with doing a lot of games, or in my case, just being old. I watched, Bud Foster was Virginia Tech's defensive coordinator for, oh my gosh, since '95.
You kind of know what his tendencies are.
Yeah, I know what they're going to do, and you can kind of see what they're doing. And if you once you do a bunch of games, you can kind of just sense it. It's the same thing. Like if you do 100 baseball games, and over the course of a minor league season, out of the corner of your eye, you'll just catch that the third baseman is guarding the line late in the game, or that the center fielder is shaded to right center because a guy's a pull hitter, or late in the game, the first baseman isn't holding the runner on because the score is 12-1 and they're just going to let him, right? You see that subconsciously because you've done so many games and so many innings and seen so many pitches. And the same thing happens in football. And basketball, the more games you do, you just pick up on things without even knowing, just like a coach would. You'll know right away that an official's out of position after doing this for 30 years, right? You don't have to say it, but you've seen the block charge call 10,000 times, and so you just kind of know what's happening without even saying it. You just kind of, it's almost like osmosis. But I think baseball guys know that, right? Because they do so many games and there's so many innings and so many pitches. But by the end of a second year of doing minor league baseball, you've seen 200,000 things happen, and you don't describe them all, but you've seen them all.
Did you ever miss doing baseball?
Yeah, that's my favorite sport.
How was Chipper Jones as a minor leaguer?
He was really good. How's that for an understatement? So I did 4 years with Richmond Braves AAA team when Grady Little was the team's manager, who I still stay in touch with. And I've told people this too. I learned more baseball from Grady Little than anybody, just being around him. And he was great, whether it was pre or post game in his office or in the dugout or in hotel rooms. And he ended up managing the Dodgers and the Red Sox, I think, as a lot of people know. And he was a star manager. He had a lot to do with the success, player development wise, of a lot of guys that ended up starring in Atlanta for many, many years. But Chipper was one of his greatest players ever, coming up out of Jacksonville. And man, he hit a baseball in it was like you and I hitting a driver off the tee. I mean, the ball would just explode off his bat. Great player.
You're assuming that the driver and the tee for me, like that would be a 6-4-3 double play.
Yeah, dribbler to the mound. I know. I've done that too.
Yeah, well, more often than not on my side. How often do you listen to stuff back? And I probably more so now doing the television side of things, but like even when you were on year 24 of radio, like how much would you listen back to stuff?
Every game, and go through it all. And are you like me? You're never as good as you think you were, and it's never as bad as you feared you were.
Yeah, I thought I was terrible in the first half this weekend. It turned out it was okay. So, and then the second half was the opposite of that.
The key is, you want to get better all the time, right? But the fact of the matter is we don't, right? Because sometimes, like 4 years into something, you just have a bad game, and that's true for players, and that's true for us as well. And the maturity aspect is you don't get frustrated with it. It's like, well, I called that guy the wrong name. I'm not going to beat myself up over it. Or I got the score wrong going to a break. How can that happen? There's these massive scoreboards, right, hanging from the roof or in the end zone of a football stadium. How can you get the score wrong? But we all do it. And you go to the break and you go, that's not the score. and then you correct yourself coming back. But the key is you just can't beat yourself up over it and try to always learn and always get better. Always learn and always get better.
I actually, my dad said to me yesterday, Ball State was trailing 20-7 on Saturday. And I said Central Michigan leads instead of 20-7. I said 2017, which is an entirely different ball game. And did notice it in the moment and caught it after the fact. Then I spoke to my dad and I go, how did it sound yesterday? He goes, good, except you said you were down 2017 at one point. I'm like, that's the thing that stuck with you? But yeah, 100% been there, done that.
Yeah, and I think, for a lot of years now, I broadcast a lot of really bad Virginia Tech basketball games and some very lopsided games. And so you're able to do in your head 72-57. That's a 15-point deficit, right? So you just do the math in your head. But inevitably, once a season, someone would hit a 3-point shot, and Florida State hits the three, 51-46. That cuts the lead to 8.
All the time.
What kind of math was that? How did that happen? And so we all do it, and then you correct yourself, or your analyst, which in my case was Mike Barnup, would talk about my Syracuse math, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And you make light of it. And I'll say this, that no matter what we're doing, the self-deprecating humor seems to be, at least for me, the way out of things. If you can laugh at yourself and make fun of yourself and have a good time with it and not beat yourself up over it, it really helps. Because it's hard, man. These especially for young people today, the money may not be what you hope, and you're wondering, is this job hirer even listening to my stuff or watching my tape, and why am I not getting a return phone call, and I'm not making any money? And you can beat yourself up over all these different things, but you can't, because it's something that we love to do, and we're like artists. We are artists, and the creativity is what we're in it for, and the craft is why we do this.
I've asked many people that have broadcast transcendent figures on this podcast before how they describe those people. I think one of my favorite ones, I said to Tim Roy, I go, how do you make every time Steph Curry does something ludicrous, how do you make it sound more ludicrous than the last ludicrous thing he did? So that each thing, it doesn't just turn into a blur. So I'm curious from your standpoint, how did you make a Mike Vick ludicrous touchdown sound different than the previous ridiculous touchdown?
I probably failed at that looking back on it. The one thing I will say is, so whenever Virginia Tech would have the ball when Michael Vick was playing here, and I know Wes was the same thing when he was doing the Falcons games and the other guys that did Michael's games, you never would ever read a drop-in, never read a card when Michael was about to take the snap, because no matter where you were on the field, you're in scoring position. So something really cool is about to happen. Whether it's an 80-yard touchdown or not, you don't know. But a 7-yard gain could be him, jumping over somebody or spinning by somebody. And so what I did is I came up with all these different ways to say grasping for air, because that's what a lot of linebackers and safeties would be doing with Vic. He had an amazing ability to juke and jive and like a hockey cut. He would cut on a dime, and except instead of snow flying, it'd be blades of grass flying up in the air, and he'd be running the other way. And you just think of creative ways to describe what he's doing.
What'd you come up with? Do you remember?
A lot of that. Now my guy Mike Burnup pulled out a great Southern colloquialism. He said that he was slicker than a peeled onion in a bowl of snot, and that was something very creative that Mike came up with in that regard.
Interesting. I don't think I've never heard that one before, but I've also not been in the South enough.
Yeah. That's one of those Southern colloquialisms. Vic was he was transcended in a way that McNabb at Syracuse had done that, and Randall Cunningham had done that. But I think Michael kind of took it to the next level, and he was just so electric. And to this day, he's the best athlete that I had a chance to work with. I think you could say who's the greatest player of all time, and people will talk about Herschel Walker, Bo Jackson, or whomever on the offensive side of the ball. I don't think anybody that I've seen more electric than Michael Vick in college. And if someone can top Vic, that'd be something really special to see.
Now that you're teaching as well, how much do you go back and revisit any type of question that we've talked about here today? Just in terms of has it made you think about things in a different way, or some way that you hadn't thought about them in 10, 15 years, because you're well known for being accessible to younger broadcasters, but now that you're doing it on an everyday basis and it's literally your job, how much have you maybe thought differently about things, or how has it maybe even helped you continue to refine what you're doing every day?
Oh my God, it's been a total life changer. First of all, I'm around a bunch of kids that have the passion like you do, right? And they're naive in a way, but they're really excited about it, and they bring this energy, and they're like a bunch of puppies. And so it's kind of neat to be around that and to work with it. And I get to learn really cool millennial phrases. And I've got this incredible urge for avocado toast at all times now, because that's all they talk about, and things like that. So that's how it's impacted me. But yeah, clearly, they watch my games, and then I get a critique every day I go back in the classroom. They're all critics just like we are. Like, you said you should do that on camera, but in reality you did this. And so I'll hear some of that.
It's fun that they watch with that kind of an eye.
Well, I'm grading their assignments, and they're grading mine. And that's fine, because, they're fans, and they know it looks good. But no, it helps a lot. And actually, you've given me a great idea. I think I should make them listen to this podcast and then put a couple of quiz questions up there. and that, you've now saved me a full day of talking.
We should just do a test word at the end, so that they only know the word if they made it to the end of the podcast. It's like one of those discount codes.
Yeah. The word is maroon. Yes. No, but this is all this is all part of the Syracuse model. Whether it was Marty Glickman that started this, is helping the next generation, or the people who are under you, and the people that are coming along. And I think Marty did that with Marv, and Marv did that with Bob Costas, and now we give annually the Marty Glickman Award at SU from Syracuse University, and it goes to a great broadcaster. But part of that is for people that have followed in Marty's tradition, which is you always have time to talk with young broadcasters or young writers, multimedia journalists now, right? Because everyone has to have the full skill set and do different things. And you see that all the time. And I'm so proud of that, Joel, because that's something that's the SU way of doing it. I know we talk an awful lot about whether it's Mike Tirico or Bob Costas or all the greats that have come through. Marv and Marty and Dick Stockton and Len Berman and all those greats, but every one of those people worked with young broadcasters, even if they didn't go to Syracuse. And that's what I'm really proud of, that our kids today are doing the same thing.
Well, if people want to get in touch with you, Bill, how do they go about finding you on social media and whatnot?
Well, I'm pretty easy to find. You can find me on Twitter and Roth Report Online. We've got a website that we launched. It's up and running, Roth Report Online, and it's a great way to get in touch with me. And if you are listening to this as a high school student, and particularly if you're in Virginia, one of the things we talk about, Joel, you know how expensive it is to go to college.
Yep.
And we've taken the Syracuse model, much of it. That's what we know. And Andrew Allegretta is here. He's another SU guy. And we're trying to bring a lot of the SU principles to a big land-grant state school. And we've got 160 kids here this year, and I think that number will grow.
All right, that is Bill Roth joining us here on Play-by-Playcast. And as we said on the top, like, regardless of what else he's accomplished in his career, to me, Bill is always going to be synonymous with teaching, with education, with helping younger broadcasters who are trying to find their way in this industry. He has so much paid it back and forward throughout his career. So as I always say on this podcast, reach out to the people that you hear if they say something that you like. Do reach out to Bill and say, hey, you heard him on the pod and you enjoyed what he said, or you wanted to pick his brain further. I am sure he would be more than happy to have that dialogue with you. Until next week, though, we are out of time. So this is PXPcast. My name is Joel Gadet. The music you're hearing is Marshmello, and we're out. Until next Friday, see ya.
And that will do it from St. Louis, where the score is inconclusive.